Okay, great. So after that, made really nice chant, which is when it wasn't on the recording. But we'll start with tonight's session. So we spoke last week about the 3 types of meditation. We looked at the Sefer Yetzirah's, that second section, the first 4 descriptions of the Sfirot, and how they connect with meditation, and what kind of meditation it is. So we saw that there's, we looked at Hitbonenut, which is connected to Bina, which is about understanding, it's about awareness, and Hitbodedut, which is a concentration practice, connected to Chokhmah. What I didn't say last week is that, just like we saw, because I mentioned it beforehand, that Chokhmah and Bina, we said it was connected to intellect and imagination, and with the Rambam, the perfect, and one of the stages of one of the prerequisites for prophecy is the perfection of the intellect and the perfection of the imagination. And so therefore we can look at it again. It's kind of like it's not just this, but it's also this. So I'm not saying that perfection in his bonanut is that perfection in intellect. It's connected to it though. It's part of it. It's kind of necessary because intellect is about awareness, about having a greater clarity of understanding. And hitbonenut, the mindfulness awareness practice, will help us develop that clarity of understanding. So that's why it's kind of connected with intellect, and hitbodedut is connected with the imagination. So this week we're going to look at how that's connected to the imagination, and we'll spend some time on it, and maybe we'll do some meditation actually during the session. It'll be not the first time we've done properly meditation during a session, and then we'll look at some texts as well, and then we'll see how much we get through this week, and how much we develop the ideas of Hitbodedut and what it means. We can then look at Hitbonenut, and then we'll come to the shilub of those 2 things, the connection between those 2 things, which is hishtachavut or Hitbonenut. There's no word for it, because it's really it's that shiluf there. It's the connection between those 2 things. It's the bridging of those 2, which is really emunah. It means an actment of faith. That's how it manifests. It's like connected with da'at, which is the meeting point between chokhmah and bina, and through that da'at, we then can move up towards da'at elyon, which is a higher knowing. Now, higher knowing is kind of living within emunah, living within faith. We said last week that the only access we have to atika kadisha, which is keter, which is the fullness of keter, is through faith. And so that's why it's kind of like that's how it manifests. But in any case, to get to that, we'll have to look at hitbodedut. So hitbodedut normally translates as it comes from the word badad, to be alone. And we saw the word badad in the previous section of the Sefer Yetzirah, where we looked at the verse Yeshev badad v'idom ki natal alav, and sit alone and be silent, for Hashem has placed this upon you. So the word badad there means alone. And the word hitbodedut comes from that. So hitbodedut is a reflexive term, which means self-isolation, which I think mentioned it last week, self-isolation. But it's a self-isolation that is both external and internal. So we'll look at some sources today, B'ezrat Hashem, and we'll see how those sources are kind of referring to hitbodedut as an external thing, but also an internal thing. What we won't look at, but might be good to look at in the coming sessions, is Avraham ben Rambam, because he was an early source who dedicates an entire chapter of his main book to hitbodedut, to the idea of isolation. He's very specific there, and Ari Kaplan actually brings it as one of his chapters in I think it's either Jewish meditation or meditation on the Bible, but he brings Avraham ben Rambam's opinion on there, where he says that there are 2 types of hitbodedut, external and internal. He says the external leads to internal, and he says the internal is close to what the goal of his practice was, which was the coming into contact, coming into communion with the God, with Hashem. So let's now look at the Sefer Yetzirah, and we'll look at the Mishnah itself, which deals with Chokhmah, and we'll see how. Well, first we'll look at the text. We'll analyze the text a little bit. We'll then look at the terminology. We'll then look at these sources that I've got today to bring before you. Okay, so here we go. So the Mishnah which corresponds to Chokhmah is the third one. Shalosh is Maim Miruach, water from breath. So water is connected to Chokhmah. Again, water we know is a metaphor for Torah, which is also connected with Chesed, and connected to the right hand side. So Chesed is connected to water, which is an aspect of or how would you say it? An unfolding, I suppose, of Chokhmah, or a reflection of Chokhmah. Within the emotional realm. So let's just read this text. Shalosh ma'ami ruach chakak bechatzav bahen kaf bet otiyot. So the third of the sfirot is water from air, from breath. He engraved or he carved. Again, so the Hebrew doesn't have. It's either it can be read in both the past, third person past, as in he engraved, or it can read as an instruction. Chakak bechatzav, engrave and carve. So we can look at it either way. So let's look at it as an instruction. Carve and engrave the 22 letters.
Oh, hi, Jim.
Engrave and carve the 22. The 22 letters. 1 second. Engrave and carve the 22 letters from mitohu vavohu refis petit, from the things called tohu vavohu, which is hard to translate. Normally, it can be translated as emptiness and void. From refes antit, which is mire and clay. Chakakan can mean aruga. So carve them, engrave them like a sort of bed, like aruga is a kind of a garden bed, not a bed, not a sleeping bed. Chatzaban can mean choma. Engrave them carve them like a wall. Tzivavan, which is in one of the nusachim, which means to surround them, but other nusachim say sichacham, which means to cover them like schach in the sukkah. Anyway, either one can mean ma'aziva, like a ceiling. B'yitzak alehem sheleg, cover them with snow. Na'asa afar, and it shall become dust. Shneimar ki lesheleg yomar heve aretz. This is the pasuk where it says, to the snow he says, become earth. So this is the thing. It's very difficult, very vague, very kind of what is it referring to. Again, like I said last week, though, the most sense it makes, this whole section, is the different ways that the letters manifest. So in the third Mishnah, in the Mishnah beforehand, we see the letters are engraved and carved, chakak bechatzav, but with the breath, right? So one way of forming these letters is through the breath, so through voice and breath. Another way is through writing. So that's why you're using, tohu vavohu is the emptiness and void, which is the paper. Refes and tit is the mire and clay is the chemicals, the substances that you use to write. And then you're writing them, the different aspects of the letters, the top of the letters, the right side of the letters, which is like the wall. The base is like either the base or the top is like this bed, this base, or the roof is the other bit. And then this is how Aaron Kaplan reads it, understands it in some ways. Then you cover it in some kind of material which would dry out this liquid, and it will become a dry solid. So that's kind of why it looks really actually like the best way, the most, I guess possibly the most accurate way of reading it is as written letters. And then the fire, letters from fire, you remember from a midrash, which talks about the primordial Torah being written with black fire on top of white fire, and that's why. And again, the first things he brings is seraphim, the angels, which Avolafi in various places refers to the angels, the letters as angels, because they are messengers of the divine. They are the means whereas God communicates. So again, communication, letters as communication, is all part of the same principle. So the angels communicate God's will, writing communicates it, or the language communicates God's will also, but also human will and our communication. So you can see connections there. But what I want to look at is I want to look at it as imagination, because I really feel like when you look at this, when you actually try to use this as a basis for your imagination, how you can use your imagination to build pictures, it really works quite well. Let's go more or less word by word and try to unpack it. So chakak v'chatzav, I've underlined it. So one of the reasons why I've underlined it is because this is a key principle within the Sefer Yetzirah and within the ecstatic Kabbalah. So one of the things which I noticed from when looking at this is that I mentioned already in the previous session, chakak v'chatzav is the gematria of vashov. So we saw ratzu vashov, running and returning. So the returning is the gematria of the chakak v'chatzav, the same gematria as vashov, as returning. So, like I said in previous sessions, you could well, actually, I'm not sure if I said this precisely, but this particular section of the Mishnah of the Sefer Yetzirah, I call section 2, is kind of a bridge between the first and the first section, which is about silence. It's about blima, about afisat hamachshava, the nullification of the effacement of thought, about the upper unity. The section 3 is about the lower unity. It's about language. It's about the universes from Bria, Yetzirah, and Asiya. And these Sfirot, which are still within the universe of Atzilut, but they've divided up and they've begun the process of language, just like it says previously, his word in them. So this is the word within the Sfirot, how they divide, and then their division creates like a polarity, like a voltage, which then precipitates a current, which is like the communication of the words and the letters between the Sfirot within, or between and outside of the Sfirot also. So this section here can be both Ratzu and both Vashov. So it can take us. So it can be Ratzu in the sense that it's now creating language and it's the means for creation. Because Baruch Shama B'raya Olam, blessed is the one who spoke and the world comes into being, like we say every morning. So this is the idea that God uses language to create the universe. Again, because of the spirit of the origins of language, they through them you can create language, through the breath and the water and the fire. So there can be an aspect of Ratzu. There can also be an aspect of Vashov, of returning, because we can take this language, these elements of language, and return up to silence. So we can take Hitbonenut practice, so we contemplate words and meaning and reflect on ideas, and that can lead us to a silence, to the place behind words, behind thought. The Apisata Machshava, we can use that. We can meditate and reach silence in that way. Or we can meditate and reach silence through a concentration practice, through Hitbonenut, through isolating the words, through focusing on sound like we did before. Or through faith, through emunah, through this shiluv between Hitbonenut and Hitbonenut, through this kind of aspect of Keter, which is the ratzon, the willingness to do so, or the faithfulness to do so, the trust in God. That can take us to silence, also to the quietening down of thoughts, like we saw previously, of the let's just look at it then. In this section we looked at last week, how their vision, the vision of the spirit is like the appearance of lightning. Their limit has no end. His word in them is running and returning. So we saw how Gra said Shuvla Makom is that everything returns to its place. So here in Mishnah number 6 we see how there is a muddling up. Language causes this muddling up of the universes. Everything kind of intermingles, and then that causes a kind of like a dynamic process there. Returning to the silence, everything means everything returns to its place, and there is no word in him. So that's why their word is running and returning. Sometimes they're speaking, like in the Chashma, sometimes they speak, and sometimes they are silent. So V'chakak v'chatzav, in this sense, it seems to be implying that this is an aspect of Vashov. So later on, in the next section of the Sefer Yetzirah, we'll see these same ideas of fire and water. So in chapter number 3, we'll see how the letters Aleph, Mem, and Shin correspond to the fire, breath, and water, and therefore they correspond to Chokhmah, Bina, Keter, Chokhmah, and Bina. So why are they different? Why is Aleph, Mem, and Shin, Keter, Chokhmah, Bina? Why is there separation there? Because the letters in section number 3 are manifestations of the Sefirot in the aspect of Ratzu, of running, of creating, right? And that's why we have different terminology here, which we'll start seeing in the second section. And actually, I'll mention it in a minute because it's part of the whole thing. So we'll actually here, you can see it says chakak in section number 3 and chapter 2. Chakakan chatzvan. So it says he engraved and he carved, but then he adds 3 other words. Tzarfan, shaklan, behemiran. These are now 5. We now got 5 words referring to the letters and how they combine and connect. So chakak v'chatzav, and actually it's not even chakak v'chatzav. Chakak v'chatzav is vashov. Now we have chakakan v'chatzvan. Chakakan v'chatzvan, which adds another. So we have vashov is 314. It's the same gematria. Is it 314? 300 vashov. No. 1 minute. No, I'm confused now. Let's go look when I look at the word in front of me. Let's see. Where is it? Okay, yeah. That's 300. Okay, so 312, 314. Yeah. So it's including the vav at the beginning of Ashov is 314, which is the same gematria as Shaddai, Shin Daled Yud, and the same gematria as the angel Memtet. Which is the angel that God sent before Bnei Israel to scope out the desert. And it says, "My name is within him," and that's why, because the name Memtet is the angel of Memtet is the same gematria as Shin Daled Yud. So you have this Chakak B'Chadzav, which is 214 plus another 100. So you have over here. Oh, actually not plus 100 less 6. So what would that be? So 414, 408. So I don't know what 408 means, but we'll don't know what 408 means. But maybe it'll come later on. We'll see what it means. Possibly, I'll have to think about it afterwards. But we see again, it's not even Vashov, it's something else. Now it's a different turn. So chakak v'chatzav here then therefore kind of implies that it's talking about a practice which leads you back up to silence, which is returning to silence. Right, so that's chakak v'chatzav. But again, like I said, it's part of a greater system of 5 letters. So the other 5 here, the other 3 are tzarfan, shaklan, behemiran. So what we did earlier on, which was the 231 gates, that included a single permutation. So, and permutation is a tzarfan. L'tzaref is to permute. L'tzaref means you take a word and you. So in Hebrew, so any word. So chakakan, we can take that word and you can permute it in any number of ways. So it's a 4-letter word. So normally a 4-letter word, you can rearrange the letters into 24 different ways. But because of double letter, there's only 12 ways of rearranging the word chakakan. So you can have chet, kuf, nun. You can have chet. So that can be one way. You can then move the nun over here. So the beginning, you can have chet, nun, kuf. Then you can have chet, kuf, nun, kuf. And that's 3 permutations. And then you can do kuf, nun, chet, kuf, chet, nun, kuf, chet, nun, kuf, chet, nun, kuf, nun, chet, kuf, nun, kuf, chet, and kuf, nun, kuf. Have I done that right? Anyway, you get the point there. So that's a permutation, and that is what it means here by tzarfan. So once you've engraved and carved the letters and made them into a word, you can now permute those letters. Meaning you can take that word and you can reorder those letters so that it says something else. So with 2 letters we did earlier, there were 2 ways of permuting. So we did aleph bet. So aleph bet is the one permutation. Bet aleph is the second permutation. So that's what that means by tarfan. Again, if you think about it, like every separate thing of the universe. So we said like a davar in Hebrew. The word davar means a word and a thing. So God created the word through speech. So that means that speech has an aspect of the thing itself. So when we speak, and again, it's the same with us as well. When we create our reality by naming things, by forming ideas around it, and this is how we categorize, and this is how we order reality and kind of make it useful to us by naming things. And so God creates the universe. Before we do that, everything is part of a oneness. Imagine there were no names to things. All you would have was your sensory perception. There wouldn't be, we're automatically, like unconsciously naming things. You have like objects, but if we just landed from space without any principle, then you'd be sitting here like a newborn baby, just receiving all this information without the ability to just discern what's in front of you. Everything is part of a one great unity. You'd have to kind of like isolate objects, move them around. You see, okay, this object is now moving around in relation to the objects around it. And now, but what is this thing? And you have to look at, so there's different ways of observing it. But you need some kind of language to be able to say that. We have a word for color. Like I can even say different color. I can just have different sensory perceptions. So language creates reality. And so after you've engraved and you've carved the letters and put them together, you then permute the letters, reorder the letters, and each one of these reordering of the letters creates a new possibility for naming something. And then you have the next. After you've done that, you have shakalan, which is shakalan means to weigh. So in terms of metallurgy, it's really interesting to see how this is the analogy it's using. So chakika is like, imagine you're going to kind of mine some ore. So the first thing you do would be to go and find where the ore is, and then you'd engrave, like, you'd find here's the ore. You can see it's a mixture of rock and metal. You engrave the area, as in like you start like chiseling out where you need what we're gonna break off, and then so that's the engraving part, the first kind of like lining out of where you're gonna be, what the ore is, and where you're gonna remove the stone from the rock, from the ore from the mountain or whatever, and then you chisel it out completely and you carve it out. So now you have this big boulder which is separate from the mountain. And then you have the tzarfan. So tzarfan means to permute, but actually it's a word meaning to refine. So letzaref means to refine, like an oil refinery. So you then take, what it means, you take this raw ore, you then put it in a furnace. And so tzarfan is like the idea of like heating something up in a furnace. And actually that's when we do that kind of practice, we generate this kind of internal heat, internal energy, which kind of then manifests as like our bodies kind of and our minds kind of like warming up. I don't know what I mean. I had to explain that, but we feel a sense of energy, feel a sense of weight and heaviness as well. And the body warms up, literally physically warms up when we do this, which is part of the relaxation response. But again, that's why the idea of litzaref, the tzarfan, is to permute this ore. And after you've got this, you've now got metal from the ore. You now have metal, which is, once it's cooled down. And what the next step would be to weigh it, to know how much you've got, right? And so in linguistic terms, what it means is that just like the Hebrew letters every Hebrew letter has a different number value, like we've been doing a gematria. So shakalan means to weigh it up, means to see what's the gematria of this word, and you can take the gematria of the word. And once you take the gematria of the word, you can then say, well, this word is also this word. So chakak v'chatzav is vashov. So now you can take. So let's say you've done all the permutation, you've engraved and carved, and we'll see what that means. The letters of vashov. And then you've permuted all those letters, and now you can weigh them. And so when you weigh them, you see, it's chakak v'chatzav. So now you have a new two words, chakak v'chatzav, and so now you can permute these. You can engrave them, carve them, you can permute them, and then you can weigh them again, and then use them another thing. The next aspect is hemiran, which means to transmute them. So in terms of metallurgy, so I'm not a metallurgist. I don't know exactly what the steps are and how the steps would work, but it seems to me that let's say you start with an iron ore, you then might want to make it into an alloy. So if you want to make it into a steel, make it iron into steel, you then have to reheat it, and mix in carbon to it, like you mix in charcoal, and then you make a carbon, you make a steel, which is an alloy between carbon and the iron. Now I'm assuming that you're going to want to do these things separately, possibly to get a pure ore of the iron, and then carbon, and then maybe you do it at the same time. I don't know. But then if you wanted to then add, I mean, in terms of let's say bronze, which is an alloy, I think, of tin and copper. So bronze is stronger than both tin and copper, and that's you need the raw alloy of the copper. You need the alloy of tin. You need to weigh it to know, to get the right concentration of like the ingredients to make the bronze the strongest, and so it holds the blade, an edge, that kind of thing. I don't know, whatever you need for it. And then you'd permute it. So you'd replace some of the copper molecules with tin molecules, some of the tin with copper, and now you have this alloy of which is now called bronze. But so that's again the analogy for in the metallurgy. But in terms of the practices, the meditation or the linguistic practices, Himiran means using some kind of code. So the most famous one is the Atbash code, where you take the letter Aleph and they take the Aleph Bet and you line it up, Aleph Bet Gimel Dal He Vav Zayin. You then, like, beneath that, you would write the Hebrew alphabet backwards: Taf, Shin, Resh, Kuf, Tzaddik, Pei, like that. And then the permutation, and then what you do is you take the Aleph from the first line and you replace it with one from the below. So Aleph turns into Taf, Taf turns into Aleph, Shin, Bet turns into Shin, Shin turns into Bet, and that's called the Atbash. And so that there is different types of ciphers to use that. There's one where you can, like that one is an example, or you can do one where you skip some letters, and there are different ways of doing it. But what happens is, and the principle behind it is that you're now forming letters, you're forming new words from pre-existing words in a very formulaic type of way. And in this way, you're like, where does it say? We'll see in a minute. Here, in this section here, this is the third section of Sefer Yetzirah, but we'll see how it says here. And that's what we looked at. We did 231 gated meditation before, but you see after he says, like, how do you how do you do this permutation, this weighing, this mishkal, gematria, and this tamura, the transmutation? You combine aleph in kulam, combine aleph with all of them, and kulam and aleph, and all of them with aleph. Until, says at the end here, you have nimtza kol yitzur b'chol hadibur b'yoseh mishem echad. Everything, all the creation, all of every word, every speech can manifest through a single name, through a single word. So you can take one word because you're transmuting in any sort of way, and eventually one thing can actually become equal to the whole thing. So everything can be manifested from one thing. Okay. So those are the 5 elements to it. Now in practice, let's say going to this, how the meditation works from it. So generally, even the Abulafa uses a lot of gematriot in his writings, and he actually uses the process of gematria all the time. The practice that comes out from him, he does use other practices, but for the way I experience it, the way I use it, when it makes sense to me, is that the seruf for me is the most important one of all of them, because that is the way to kind of heat up the mind and to create this new sense through it, and to prepare the mind for what it does is it takes you into the deep levels of concentration and hitbodedut, which we'll look at in the next in a minute. So that's how I use Abulafa techniques. So you wouldn't use the mishkal and the tmura very often. So most of your time when you're doing the Abulafa techniques, you'll be doing either a haskara, which is a pronunciation practice, which is not here. It's probably more connected to the ruach practice, which is a pronunciation using the breath and pronouncing, rather than this kind of which can be that spoken, or it can be just internally, mentally spoken. You speak it in your mind. Again, if you're doing a tziruf practice, which is what Ablafi calls hitbodedut, in his books, and what actually we'll look in Chaim Vital, he also calls this hitbodedut and other places as well. That this is referring specifically to the tziruf practice, which is the letter permutation practice, and and then so you take a word and you'd go through those permutations, and then at the end of those permutations you can then do a mishkal. You find the word. Actually, mishkal is actually different to gematria, because mishkal you have to make. So for example, what we said vashov and chakak bechatav, that's not a mishkal. Mishkal, you need to retain the same number of letters. So if you wanted to find a mishkal of vashov, then you'd have to find a word which has the numerical value of 314, but also has 4 letters. So there are some, in fact, it's very straightforward. You can just, you can add a zayin to the vav and of the first vav, and then take away an aleph. So add an aleph to the first vav to make it a zayin, and take away an aleph from the second vav and make it into a hey, and then you have a new word. So you have what would it be? Vashov would turn into za shahav, and you can do a permutation on that to maybe it makes a meaningful word on that. But that would be an example of a mishkal, right? It's the same gematria, and also the same number of words. But a gematria again, but the gematria it still works like that. But that's what specifically the Ablafi understands within the Kabbalistic, the ecstatic Kabbalah. That's what's understood as mishkal. And a Tmora again is the permutation. So you do it. So once you've gone through this permutation, which takes the most amount of time, you then do a mishkal or a gematria, and then you find a new word, and then you do a tziruf on that one, and then you might do a Tmora, where you're replacing it with a cipher, with a code, like the Adabash, for example, and then you do tziruf on that one as well. So the majority of the time you're doing a tziruf practice. And you'll see in Abulafi, a lot of the time he's doing a tziruf, like that'll be the primary thing you turn to. So for me, this is the meditation practice, and why I find it as powerful is that this takes you to deep levels of concentration. But if you look later on, like in later Kabbalists, in particular the Arizal, and in the Kavanot of the Baal Shem Tov, the early ones, you'll see how the use of gematria and the Tmura is much more commonly found so this is the practice of Yichudim of the Arizal and the Kavanot, and you'll see how a lot of times they'll be using gematria to connect between different spirot, and then a Tmura. So for example, you have Yud Hey Vav Hey. The famous one is mitzpatz. Yud Hey Vav Hey with I think it's Atbash. The Yud turns to the Mem, the Hey turns to the Tzadeh, and the Pei and the Vav turns into a Pei. So you have it's from Yud Hey Vav Hey. You have Mem Tzadeh Pei Tzadeh, and that's using the Atbash cipher. So again, and then you do gematria on mitzpatz, which I think is 300. 300? Yes, 300. So and that has again. So then you'd use this practice where that connects to that through this mishkal, there's gematria, and then Tmura also. So that's kind of a practice which is very, very common. It's like it's the norm that happens in the Yichudim of the Ari. But those yichudim, some of them I guess are used to bring you to a state of silence. But most of the time, the yichudim are used as a way of imbuing the tikkunim of the physical. So it's more a creative act rather than a kind of an act which takes you to kind of the prophetic experience of the silence. It's more about what we haven't looked at, but the idea of the Ishtadlut de Kuchabricho de Kaima Be'ovada. So the service of God which is established in a word, which the Bet Yaakov says there is a deeper level of truth, and that's why the Maggid was supposed to have spent last periods of his life working on the Maaseh Bereshit, the lower unity, which is harder to kind of establish, to manifest, because the idea is that it's harder to establish God's unity within this world of division, and that's why it's a hard thing. It's easy to see God's unity when everything is one, when there is no thinking, but it's hard to see God's unity when there is thinking, when there is divisions of separation. So the way it manifests, actually, just to give you kind of foreshadowing, the way it manifests is the same principle of Shem Echad He, one name, or another way of putting it, Guf Echad. So the lower unity is actually a way of comes from this idea of one name. Everything is called by one name. Everything is one body. The whole universe can be called is one body, even though we separate objects. This a mouse, this book holder, whatever else you've got. You can separate them by name, but actually they all come under one name, whatever that name is, the universe, whatever that name is, and also one body. So the whole universe is one single body, and we are all different limbs, different organs of that body. So that's the Maaseh, how that lower unity is established, and that's why there's Yichudim and with the Mishkan and Tzaruf. That's why it comes to support in there, because it shows how everything is it's basically the same thing. Everything is part of the same thing, like that. Okay. Okay, so let's move on now. So that was kind of a long kind of introduction to this idea of Chakak Bechatzav. We'll look later on, and once I go through the rest of it, we'll see how it manifests in practice. But when we get to the practice, and actually, because looking at the time, we may have to leave that until next week. But let's carry on. So engrave and carve the 22 letters from Toho Vavoho Refes Batit. So the Gra, fascinatingly, he does his gematria on this. He says that the gematria of Toho Vavoho Refes Batit is Ratzu Vashov. So he does the gematria on these things, and he sees that this is Ratzu Vashov, which is kind of interesting. How we see that this idea, that this running and returning, the speech and the language is in this idea of Toho Vavoho Ratzu Vashov. And now these, so the way I understand it is that Toho Vavoho Ratzu Refes and Tit are 4 stages of practice, 4 stages of levels of absorption, levels of concentration. And Ratzu Vashov is you running in between these 2 things. So there is there are different levels of absorption. We can move one back, one through, one run to one and return to the other. So returning to a deeper level of absorption, and we'll see how the progression. So here it's Toho Vavoho Refes and Tit, and we'll see how in the sources they use different words to describe it. But what we see here is this Toho Vavoho Refes and Tit seems to parallel the next 4 levels here. Right, so first of all, the next bit is Chakakan can mean Aruga, so that's 1. Chatzavan can mean Choma, that's 2. Sivavan can mean Maziva, that's 3. And V'yitzak Alehem Sheleg V'naseh Afar, that's 4. So Naseh Afar is a consequence of the V'yitzak Alehem Sheleg. It's not you don't make it. So Nasa means it happens by itself. So those are the 4 things, and it seems to me that they corresponds to the Toho Vavoho. Right, and then we see the words Chakak Bechatzav coming back in there. So we have Chakak Bechatzav. Now we have Chakakan can mean Aruga, and then Chatzavan can mean Choma. So there's a separation there is a difference between Chakak Bechatzav. And we've already seen what the meaning of Tziruf, Mishkan, and Tumurah is. We haven't looked at what the meaning of Chakak Bechatzav, which we'll look at in a minute. All right. Lost my cursor. So where am I? Right. So these 4 seem to me to correspond to the different aspects of Toho Vavoho. So therefore, the idea of Chakak Bechatzav connects with Toho Vavoho, with these different aspects. Toho Vavoho, Refes and Tit. So what I said about imagination previously is that I kind of use this as a way of kind of seeing what imagination is. So when sometimes I'll do a visualization technique, and you'll sit and you'll close your eyes and you'll want to visualize something. So we did this a few years ago. I did this really powerful meditation where we visualize ourselves being at the kotel, and then going into the mikveh, which is next to the kotel there, and walking to the Beit HaMikdash, and then eventually going into the Kodesh Kodashim and into Gan Eden through there. And at some later date, maybe I can actually teach that on this channel. Really powerful technique. But I found during that time when I was working on these imagination techniques and visualizations, that the best place to start with a visualization is from the ground. So normally what you would do with a visualization, what people might do, would be to close your eyes and imagine things around you. Now I find it creates a kind of looseness. It doesn't create a very stable or a very immersive experience. So if you want to have an immersive experience, you should start with the ground beneath you. So you'd close your eyes and you would literally do chaka kan kamin aruga. You would forget about trying to visualize anything around you. You just try to visualize what's beneath you. So and that means visualizing using all your senses. So if you want to imagine yourself, for example, lying on the grass or sitting on the grass, you would imagine your weight, or imagine under your feet is soil and grass, and you'd feel that under your feet. You'd feel the temperature of the grass under your feet. You can imagine yourself barefoot on the grass. You can imagine the temperature and the texture of the grass. And you can imagine yourself reaching down with your hands and touching that and feeling the softness, the sponginess of the earth and the coolness of the grass. And if there might be some dew on the grass, you might feel wet there. And that sharp texture or the softness of the grass, whichever grass you happen to be lying on or sitting on. And you can imagine kind of like just feeling the ground beneath you. And that, so for me, that just doing it like this now helps me visualize, this ground beneath me, and I can feel this imaginary grassland beneath me. And the more I kind of dwell on that, the feeling of the ground beneath me, I don't have to look up. Suddenly it starts expanding outwards, and I can kind of imagine the grass, the color of the grass underneath me as well, expanding towards the horizon. And that is the Chaka Kan Kamin Aruga. It is engraving them like a bed. It's the beginning of it. You can see the outline of it. And then you would do Chatzavan Kamin Choma. From that ground, from the horizon, that you can start building up the scenery around you. So you can feel the ground beneath you. You can feel the warmth where the sun is shining onto the ground, and you can feel the earth and the solidity of it underneath you. And then you can start imagining that there are trees perhaps around you in the distance, or some kind of landscape in front of you. There might be some rocks or things around you, a wall maybe behind you. You can see things going off to the distance on the left-hand side, and you can start building up. And so it creates a much more solid space than to just imagine like the walls of your visualization just out in like the distance, because you're literally grounded in this visualization. It connects to where you are, to where your feet are, because we're always sitting. We're never placed in a kind of undefined circle around with stuff around us. We're always connected literally to the place beneath us. That is the most solid place that we can imagine. And from that we can expand outwards and build the surroundings, build this wall around us. If anyone's familiar with Star Trek, you can see how like there's a holodeck where you have this three-dimensional space with the 4 walls around you, and the ground and the ceiling above, and the projection is the holograms are projected from there. But you can imagine how the walls around you, that's the walls of your visualization, wherever it extends to. You might see creatures walking there, birds flying through there as well. And then once you've done the Chatzavan Kamin Choma, you can then do the Sivavan Kamin Ma'aziva. Well, actually, Sichachan makes more sense because it's like surrounding it. It's like schach, covering up with schach, and that schach is the sky above you, whatever's above you, whatever kind of visualization is above you. You see the sun in the sky. And now you can feel the sun's beams as well on your skin, on your body. You feel the breeze, the wind, the air. You can see the sky and the birds flying in the sky above you. The clouds moving across the sky. So when we build up the visualization like this from the ground, from the walls around us, the surroundings, then the sky and the ceiling above us, we have this complete solid visualization, not something loose which is not connected. That's why we start from the ground and move our way outwards and upwards, rather than starting from the walls, moving down, moving up. It's much more stable to visualize it from the ground upwards. And then we tackle Amshelig, and you shall rain snow on them. So again, the Gra says that snow is the upper waters. Upper waters are frozen like that, and they establish the lower waters. Now, if you look at meteorologically, precipitation has to condense around some kind of particles. So you can't have any condensation, which means that you can't have water condensing out onto nothing, and that water can't freeze if it hasn't condensed onto something. So you have to have some kind of particles in the air, some kind of aerosol or dust particles or whatever it might be within, onto which the steam or mist, or not even the steam, the water vapor to condense around to make, which is the steam, or to make it, or actually maybe that's not right. But in any case, you don't have anything to condense around to create the water droplets, which will then freeze and rain down, and then they come and create dust. We had a sandstorm a few months back, and it rained and it dropped dust, sand. I think it was the Saharan sand even, all over the place. My car was covered in Saharan sand, and the garden outside is covered in Saharan sand. So you see that the rain brings down. So it was kicked up the sandstorm, and it condensed into the sky. Water condensed on it, and then it rained it down, depositing it onto the earth. So the snow literally becomes dust. But I think for me, it's kind of like the way of solidifying the image. I'm just going to for 1 minute stop sharing and just look at my note that I wrote on it. I remember writing a note. I can't remember exactly what I wrote on it. Hold on a second. Let's see what I wrote on that one. Yeah, so I mean, literally wrote, he sprinkled snow upon them and they became dust, i.e. real. So that's what I meant. That was what I can remember. So yeah, so that I understood when I wrote that note that the dust that sprinkling upon them snow is that we create some kind of reality out of it. We make it into a real thing. So that the final step is that the visualization. After we've built the ground, built the walls, and built the ceiling above us, we sprinkle fairy dust on it and it becomes real. Just like in Pinocchio, sprinkle some fairy dust and it becomes real, or in Peter Pan. Again, that's how we can look at it possibly. Again, maybe there must be more to it. I feel like there's more to it. Obviously, it's based on the pasuk. When you look at the pasuk and the commentators on the pasuk, you can see what it says there at some point. But that's kind of, for me, that's how it develops that thing. And so you see that the visualization becomes much stronger. When we do the ground, it's begun something. We have some kind of grounding in that experience there. It's one level of concentration. But then we built the walls around us. It's another deeper level of concentration. Then we have the ceiling. Suddenly we're completely surrounded by this visualization. And that's a pretty solid visualization. But the fourth level is one where it becomes absolutely real. And this is like the level of like a lucid dream where you can literally, where it's like a lucid dream is when you wake up in your dreams and you can actually see the world, see this image, that this world that your mind has created. That's the deepest level of concentration. So there are 4 levels of, what we've looked at, the 4 levels of concentration, they manifest in the Kabbalah. And what I want to do is look at those levels, but I think I'm going to leave it till next week because I'm just looking at the time. So let's do it. Let's leave it until next week because it's going to take too much time. I've got too much of them to do here. So next week, B'ezrat Hashem, we'll go through. I'll just tell you what we'll go through. We'll go through this book Sulam Aliyah, a section on that which talks about the different levels of different stages of absorption, different levels of meditation practice. We'll then look at so the Sulam Aliyah was a 16th century, I believe. He was an ecstatic Kabbalist in Yerushalayim. And then Yehuda Albertini was his name. And then we'll look at Sha'arei Kedusha of the Rav Chaim Vital. And his quoting, actually this is the earliest source of this really, because he quotes verbatim from the Meirata 9, which is Yitzhak Demin Akko, who was very possibly an actual Talmud student of Abulafia. So yeah, maybe we'll look at that one first. And then in those books we'll see 3 types of concentration. And then to get the 4th concentration, we'll look at Sabat Rivash. And the concentration here is actually the lesser one. These other books, they have a deeper level of concentration, but they don't mention the earlier one, the basic one. And if I remember, maybe we'll look at Rambam on. Have to remind me. Look at the Rambam on Hitbodedut as well, and also Avraham ben Rambam on Hitbodedut. And in any case, so I hope that was useful and helpful. And I'll see you next week.
Sounds exciting. I like the meditation you were talking about, the visualization in the Beit Mikdash, you said.